I wasn't supposed to find this. The basement of the county courthouse wasn't even listed on the building's blueprints. I only stumbled into it because the janitor had forgotten to lock the service stairwell. The air grew colder the deeper I descended, like every step took me backward in time. By the time I reached the bottom, my throat tasted of rust, and my hands came away damp from the banister, slick with something that wasn't just condensation. There was no light except for the weak cone of my flashlight. Dust floated in the air like ash. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of pipes overhead. My beam cut across the room and landed on rows of unmarked cabinets, the kind you'd expect in an abandoned archive, their steel eaten with rust, their drawers swollen shut. But one drawer, halfway down the far wall, had already been pried open. Inside lay a book. Not a ledger of taxes or deeds, but something that looked older, its cover bound in cracked leather, the edges swollen from water damage. The spine had no title, no label. Only a number had been carved, deep and deliberate, into the hide, 43. When I lifted it, the book exhaled rot, like mildew and grave dirt. The pages clung together, but enough came loose for me to see fragments of names, dates, and columns written in a hand both neat and obsessive. Many lines had been deliberately blacked out, the ink so thick it cut through to the next page. But 3 names, scattered across decades, remained untouched. The same surname, always repeating, Harold. One entry in particular stopped me. 1821. The child was taken under doctrine. Husband and brother made one. Union sealed in silence. The word doctrine had been underlined 3 times, pressed hard enough that the page had torn. My thumb traced the indentation, and I felt the strange urge to close the book and put it back. Instead, I turned the pages more frantically, as if the ledger itself wanted me to stop. Whole passages were violently obscured. One sheet was missing entirely, ripped from its spine, only the jagged teeth of paper left behind. On another page, faint indentations of writing appeared under the blackout, like someone had tried to erase history but couldn't erase the pressure of the hand that wrote it. I leaned closer, tilting my flashlight across the paper, and saw 3 words emerge in ghostly outline: the Hollow Doctrine. That was when I realized my breathing had changed. I wasn't reading anymore, I was trembling. My pulse pressed hard against my temples, and the silence in that basement had thickened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I should have walked away. I should have left the book where it was. But I couldn't shake the repetition of that surname, or the strange, ritualistic phrasing of the entry. Husband and brother. Union sealed in silence. I needed to know why this ledger had been hidden, who had placed it here, and why the county had gone to such lengths to bury its existence. I slid the book into my bag, my hands clammy against the leather, and climbed back toward the light. Only later, replaying the moment in my head, did I realize something else. When I had opened that drawer, the layer of dust hadn't been undisturbed. Someone else had been here before me. Someone had left it open. And perhaps, they wanted me to find it. The first time I searched the name Harold alongside the Hollow Doctrine, the trail led not to the courthouse or even local genealogies, but to a school. A place I had driven past countless times without thinking, the Harold Institute for Reformative Study, founded in 1894 on the outskirts of our county, where the rail line dissolves into farmland and pine. On paper, the institute was one of those earnest progressive-era projects, a school for wayward children, as the brochures claimed. It was staffed by ministers' wives, local teachers, and county trustees. The founding charter, signed in neat ink, called it a sanctuary of moral uplift, where broken families find renewal through faith and discipline. That's the story still told at the local historical society. The docents speak warmly about the Harold family's philanthropy. There's even a bronze plaque outside the crumbling building, green with patina, declaring it a house of light in a troubled age. But the files I pulled from the state archives told a different story. Enrollment records exist in abundance, hundreds of children admitted between 1894 and 1927. They arrived mostly from poor Appalachian families, some from immigrant communities, others transferred directly from county orphanages. The ledgers list their names, ages, reasons for admission. Disobedience. Illegitimacy. Defect of speech. Unruly character. But there are no graduation records. No transfer slips. No documentation of anyone ever leaving. Even the census records are wrong. In 1900, the county recorded 47 children housed at the institute. In 1910, 53. In 1920, 61. Always new names. Never repeats. The ledgers fill, and then end, abruptly. As if the children simply dissolved into the institution itself. And then there was the founder. Father Alden Harold. The surname jolted me when I first read it, the same name etched into the courthouse ledger a century earlier. But here, in the public-facing records, he was portrayed as a reformer of shining reputation. Newspapers called him the orphan's shepherd. He gave speeches at Methodist conferences. His writings on kinship reform were published in early social work journals, where he argued that society's failures could be healed only by restoring broken family bonds in sacred union. The phrase chilled me. I recognized its cadence immediately: husband and brother made one. Union sealed in silence. Father Harold was not simply running a school. He was institutionalizing a doctrine. Buried in the basement of the county library, I found a stack of inspection reports, the kind filed by state agents when they audited charitable institutions. Most were bland, perfunctory, dormitories adequate, meals served on time. But one, dated March 12, 1913, had been flagged in red pencil and never published. The inspector had scrawled a note at the margin: children unaccounted for. When asked about transfers, staff became evasive. Father Harold insists all remain under covenant until maturity. No clear definition of maturity given. Recommend further inquiry. No such inquiry followed. The next report, in 1915, makes no mention of missing children at all. The official history freezes there, the last surviving report before the institute shuttered in 1927, after a fire of uncertain origin. The building still stands, skeletal, its roof caved in, the windows gaping like sockets. The locals say it's haunted, the way they do about any ruin too inconvenient to restore. But now, with the ledger in my possession, I can't see it as just another derelict building. It is a mausoleum. A place where children entered and never came back. And if Father Harold's doctrine was alive in 1821 and institutionalized in 1894, then it was not some isolated family tradition. It was systemic. It was sanctioned. And somehow, it was still hidden in plain sight. The first testimony I uncovered was not in any archive but in a shoebox, donated to the county museum by a family who thought it was just old letters. The box contained brittle envelopes, tied with twine, most dated between 1907 and 1912. The paper was yellowed, the ink fading, but what unsettled me wasn't age, it was repetition. The letters were addressed to different families, scattered across the state. But they all began the same: dearest mother, I am doing well. My studies keep me busy. I feel blessed for the care given here. I hope you are well. Every letter ended the same too: in faith and obedience, your loving child. No names. No personal details. Just the same sentences, copied word for word, as if dictated by an invisible hand. I read through dozens, waiting for some flicker of individuality, but there was none. It was as if the children inside the institute had been stripped of their voices and replaced with a single one. In the margin of one envelope, however, I found something different: a faint indentation, pressed hard into the paper, but never inked. Tilting the page to the light, I could just make out 3 words scratched into the fibers: my name's gone. That was when I started noticing the pattern elsewhere. At the ruins of the institute, beneath the caved-in roof, I found fragments of slate chalkboards leaning against a wall. One bore rows of names written in chalk, but every name had been crossed out, not erased, but violently scored through, gouged so deep the chalk broke. The only word left untouched was etched above them all: doctrine. In the state hospital's archives, I uncovered intake slips for patients transferred from the institute. The slips didn't list names, only descriptions: female, 14, docile temperament. Male, 12, difficulty with language. As though the children had become specimens, stripped of identity before being moved deeper into the system. And then there were the photographs. At the library's genealogy wing, I found an album labeled Class Portraits, Herald Institute, 1901 to 1910. Each photograph was nearly identical, rows of children standing stiffly in front of the same brick wall, their uniforms drab, their hair cropped close. No smiles. No individuality. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary school portraits. But the more I studied them, the stranger they became. The faces repeated. Not literally, but the poses, the spacing, the angles were so uniform they could have been stamped out like coins. One boy's expression appeared so similar in 3 different years that I thought it was the same photograph until I noticed the growing shadow of a tree creeping across the wall in each one. It wasn't a boy captured 3 times. It was different children, all forced into the same expression, the same posture, the same erasure of self. But one portrait stopped me cold. In the bottom row of the 1908 photograph, a girl sat stiffly with her hands folded. Unlike the others, her eyes weren't fixed on the camera. They stared slightly off to the side, as though someone had whispered her name just before the shutter clicked. And scratched faintly into the margin of the photo, visible only in the right light, was a name: Eliza. It was the only instance, across hundreds of documents, where a child's own name had fought its way back into the record. That single word broke me. For weeks, I carried the photograph with me, studying her expression. It was defiant, but also weary, like she already knew she would be forgotten. The Herald Institute hadn't just imprisoned children. It had stripped them of memory, voice, and self until they were nothing but echoes. And yet, somehow, one name remained. Eliza. Her existence meant the system wasn't perfect. Something had slipped through. And if I could trace her, maybe I could unravel what the doctrine really did to those it consumed. The ruins of the Herald Institute had been picked over by vandals, thrill-seekers, and urban explorers for decades, but none of them had found what I was searching for. The main building was a husk: broken roof, graffiti on the walls, beer cans in the stairwells. Ordinary ruin. But the ledger and the testimonies whispered that the true work of the doctrine had never been visible from the outside. It was only when I pressed on a warped panel behind the assembly hall that I discovered the passage. The wood gave way with a sigh, revealing a narrow stairwell of stone, not brick like the rest of the structure. It descended steeply, far deeper than the basement foundation should have allowed. The air grew cooler with each step, humid and metallic, as though I were walking into a lung filled with blood. At the bottom, my flashlight beam cut across a corridor that shouldn't have existed. The architecture was wrong. The walls curved inward, and the floor slanted slightly to one side, forcing my balance to shift. Doors lined the passage, but each had been bricked shut, except one. I pried it open with a crowbar I'd brought, and the stench nearly knocked me over. Inside was a small chamber with a single chair bolted to the floor. Chains dangled from the armrests. The walls were covered in faint chalk markings, most rubbed away by desperate hands. One phrase repeated enough times to remain legible: silence is obedience. In another room, further down, I found cabinets of glass vials, their labels curled with age. Laudanum. Chloral hydrate. Opiates used to quiet children, to bend them into submission. The records I'd read spoke of silence therapy and discipline of stillness. Here, the euphemisms had form: chemical shackles disguised as treatment. But the deeper I went, the stranger the building became. I turned into a stairwell that seemed to spiral upward, only to find myself back where I started, staring at the chair room again. The angle of the walls made no sense, the geometry folded in on itself, like the institute had been built according to rules of another order. That was when I saw the photographs. A bundle of them lay scattered on the damp floor, curling at the edges. They showed children seated in those same chairs, their heads bound with blindfolds, mouths gagged, arms restrained. Candles ringed the room in each photo. But what unsettled me wasn't the ritualistic staging, it was the consistency. Every photograph was framed from the exact same angle, with the same blurred hand holding the camera in the corner of the frame. Whoever documented these therapies had done so obsessively, methodically, as if creating scripture. I turned one photograph over, and in the damp cardboard backing, ink bled through in looping script, "To strip the self is to make room for union." That was when the candlelight shifted. I hadn't brought candles. I had only my flashlight, and yet, in the far corner of the chamber, a stub of wax was burning, fresh, its flame too steady for this stagnant air. I approached, and the closer I came, the more the walls themselves seemed to breathe, moisture seeping from their cracks like sweat. When I blew out the candle, it flared back to life. A whisper followed, low and breathless, as though pressed directly against my ear, "Eliza." I nearly dropped the photograph. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would burst through my ribs. I swept my light across the chamber, but nothing moved, nothing stirred. The candle guttered again, then steadied. I stumbled back into the passage, my breath ragged. The geometry had shifted once more, the stairwell now slanted upward in a different direction, as though the building itself was reconfiguring to hold me inside. That was when I understood, the institute had not been abandoned. Its bones were alive, shaped by doctrine, holding its secrets tight. And Eliza, or whatever was left of her, was still inside. The Herald Institute had always been spoken of in the county as a tragic anomaly, a failed experiment, a single ruin among many forgotten reforms. But as I sifted deeper through the records, it became harder to believe that story. The first clue came from a brittle ledger buried in a box mislabeled tax records, 1912. Inside, the neat columns listed not just the names of children enrolled at the Herald Institute, but annotations at the margins. Transfers. I expected to see references to other schools, other orphanages. Instead, there were cryptic initials, WH 1909 DS or MC 1911 VO. At first, they meant nothing. But a folded map tucked into the back made their meaning clear. It was a county map, hand-drawn, marked with small black crosses. Some I recognized instantly, the Herald Institute, the old Milltown Asylum, the St. Aurelia's Orphanage. Others I had never heard of, farmhouses, convents, buildings without names. Alongside them, the same initials repeated, DS for Daughters of Silence. VO for Vale Orphanage. OFV for Order of the Fifth Vale. The same doctrine, the same language of silence and union, scattered across the state like a hidden network of roots beneath the soil. The more I traced, the larger the pattern grew. In one box, I found a letterhead stamped with a sigil, a circle cleaved by a single vertical line, flanked by two smaller crescents. The seal appeared again in a journal of Father Harold's, a leather-bound book where he wrote not of his orphans, but of the covenant children entrusted to the doctrine. He described visits from sisters, in white linen, arriving by train, carrying documents and opiates in plain crates. I realized then, Father Harold had not founded anything. He had administered one chapter in a broader covenant. But the most sickening discovery came from the registry. In a folder marked Transfers 1922 to 1925, I found an index card written in the same neat hand I had seen before. It listed initials, ages, transfer destinations. But one entry made my stomach collapse. BR, age 7. Covenant transfer, 1924. OFV. My initials. My grandfather's exact age in 1924. I dug further and found my family listed again, further back, Harold by marriage, my great-grandmother's maiden name. The web was not just around me, it ran through me. My own bloodline had been bound to the doctrine, whether as its keepers or its subjects. The implications rattled in my skull. The stories my family told of charity work with orphans, of cousins who vanished into special schools, were not misfortunes of poverty or disease. They were part of the system. The system had reached into my lineage, had scrubbed away names, had replaced family history with silence. It wasn't confined to one ruin. It was a network spanning counties, states, decades. And there were still living people who knew, who maintained the secrecy. At the bottom of the folder, folded and stained, was a formal document written in careful calligraphy. Its title read, The Covenant of the Fifth Veil. Its first line, to preserve the silence, the chosen are bound. Their names shall be erased. Their bonds shall be rewritten. Their voices shall dissolve, so that the union may endure. I closed the file with shaking hands. This was not an accident of history. It was an ongoing doctrine, a deliberate inheritance. And my family had been part of it all along. By the time I reached the institute one last time, the storm had rolled in. Rain clattered against the hollow frame of the building, dripping through broken rafters, hissing across the stone steps like static. I carried with me the ledger, the transfer files, the covenant parchment. Proof enough to damn not just the Harold family, but every institution tied to the fifth veil. But proof also meant exposure. And exposure meant every family whose history had been rewritten, whose ancestors had been silenced, would see their legacy dragged into the open, not as victims, but as participants. Inside the gutted halls, the passage behind the panel yawned like a wound. My flashlight trembled as I descended once more into the underbelly. The air reeked of mildew and rusted iron, but also, faintly, impossibly, of candle smoke. In the chamber with the bolted chair, I wasn't alone. A girl stood there. Her dress was tattered, the color leached away, her bare feet wet against the stone floor. The same face from the photograph, unmistakable even through the pallor of death. Eliza. She didn't speak at first. She only raised her hand and pointed to the chair. And in that moment, the room shifted. I wasn't seeing the ruin anymore, I was seeing the ritual as it had been. A child, thin, trembling, was being strapped down. Hands too large tightened the chains. A gag was pulled across her mouth. A voice, calm and sermon-like, intoned, "To strip the self is to make room for union." Eliza's eyes locked with mine across the years, and for the first time, she spoke, "Will it matter if I get out?" Her voice cracked like dry paper, but the weight of it hollowed my chest. The question wasn't just hers. It was every child whose name had been erased, every life dissolved into silence. Did exposure mean justice, or did it mean condemning their memories to the same machinery of spectacle and denial that had hidden them for so long? I looked down at the bundle of documents in my hands, the files, the names, the covenant. To publish them would be to rip open generations of hidden wounds, to brand whole families with the stain of complicity. But to destroy them meant Eliza's name, and all the others, might vanish again, locked in silence forever. The storm rattled through the stairwell above, rainwater coursing down the stone walls like tears. My heart felt torn in two. Eliza stepped closer, her form flickering, her voice low. "If you remember me, then I get out." Her words weren't pleading. They were certain. She wasn't asking to be saved in this world. She was asking not to be erased. I knelt, my knees cold against the stone, and pulled a single sheet from the bundle, the photograph of her, the name she had carved into its margin. That much I could keep. That much I could hold. The rest, the ledger, the parchment, the maps, I placed on the chair. My lighter trembled in my hand, but when I struck it, the flame caught instantly, hungry as though the room itself had been waiting for it. The fire rose, feeding on old ink, brittle parchment, binding leather. The chamber filled with the smell of scorched history. Eliza watched in silence, her face calm, the corners of her mouth lifting in something that was not quite a smile. When the last page crumbled to ash, she stepped back into the dark. Her figure dissolved, leaving only the faint glow of a single candle on the stone floor. I hadn't lit it. And when I tried to blow it out, the flame refused. I left it burning. So that somewhere, in silence, her name would endure. The papers called it nothing more than a collapse. Storm weakens historic structure, county declares unsafe. A photograph showed the institute reduced to rubble, its brick walls folded inward, its skeletal roof swallowed by weeds and rainwater. The official report named the cause as prolonged water damage, accelerated by lightning strike. No mention of chambers, of ledgers, of rituals. The record would stand, clean and tidy. A ruin consumed by time, nothing more. When the county workers hauled away the debris, they noted nothing unusual. The bricks were carted to a landfill, the warped beams set aside for burn piles. Bones, if they were found, were chalked up to animal remains. The site was paved with gravel, fenced off, marked as condemned. The archives, too, had been corrected. The enrollment ledgers disappeared from the Historical Society shelves, replaced with a single microfilm reel titled Herald Institute, 1894 to 1927. It contained nothing but sanitized photographs and a single pamphlet praising Father Harold's selfless dedication. The inspector's flagged report from 1913 was gone. The registry of transfers no longer existed. What the world wanted was closure, and closure meant silence. But not everything was erased. When I returned weeks later, I found the ruin still fenced, rain pooling in its foundations. I pressed through the chain link and walked the rubble alone. And there, among the stones, half buried in silt, lay a small object that had escaped the fire. A locket. Brass, tarnished green, its hinge rusted. I pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a fragment of paper no larger than a fingernail, pressed flat against the metal. A child's hand had scrawled a single word in pencil, faint but legible still, Eliza. I held it in my palm until the rain blurred the letters into nothing. The county will tell you the Herald Institute fell by accident, a building left too long to rot. They will tell you no children died there, no names were lost, no doctrines whispered in locked rooms. They will tell you the silence is natural. But I know better. I wasn't supposed to find this. And silence is never natural. 2e.